G'day, mate. There's one particular class in WoW Classic that has always intrigued but never quite pulled me in, and that is the Shaman class. I actually said to these guests before we started recording, apologetically, that it's something where I actually don't have a boatload of really curious, really insightful questions at times for this class, because I just don't know where to start with them. I've really not played one. I absolutely defer to the experts because I know nothing of the class. I looked at the talent trees today and I was like, oh, wow, okay. I actually here's how much of a dickhead I am. I discovered for the first time today that Shaman couldn't dual wield in Classic. I've never fought against one because I play Horde. So I never fucking noticed what the Shaman were doing. And I was like, oh, there you go. That's how little I know about Shaman. But I'm so glad that I've got the experts here to explain what's going to happen to Shaman in TBC. And let's get through them now. A countdown favorite, Melderon. Mate, how's things?
Great. Wonderful. Thanks for having me, Josh.
Mate, always a pleasure. And we've brought back from Zombie Countdown, Zareta. How are you, man? Good to hear from you again.
Yeah, it is exciting to be here talking about Shamans and TBC.
Very, very happy to have you. And I'm most excited to have this third guest on, not to slight any of the other guests, but Melderon has talked this person up many, many times in the past to me, and I've had the pleasure of speaking to them off the record about, it must have been a year and a half ago or something. Egregious. Mate, how are you?
Good. Hopefully we don't disappoint, but I'm excited for TBC as well.
No, I'm sure you won't, mate. But if you remember, you and I remember it was late at night where I was in the world, but we chatted for almost 2 hours one night. And as I say, it wasn't even a call for Countdown. We just touched base.
Yeah,
and, yeah, you were so incredibly smart about, with the things you had to say about the game. And I really do regret that we never got you on Countdown before, but I'm so happy that we're, getting rid of that now and getting you on the show. So let's get stuck into it, guys. And I just wanted to open, as we do on the show, we start pretty general and I let you warm up and then we'll get to the tough stuff later. But, in terms of Shaman, I just explained to you how it's a class that I've had little to no interest in, probably the least amount of interest in outside of the Paladin, which is just in a class all on its own in terms of my disinterest. But while I actively hold things against the Paladin because I think it's a shit class, I don't feel that way. I don't feel that way about Shaman. There is a sense of intrigue to it about me. I'm like, oh, wow, I think it would be kind of cool to be an Elemental Shaman or a Resto Shaman, but I've never felt tempted to pull the trigger. When people talk about Shaman to you, and obviously keeping in mind more the TBC Shaman than the Classic Shaman, do you get a little upset that it doesn't garner more interest amongst the community? And I'll throw this open to the floor. Any of you jump in.
Well, I think interest is a difficult word to play with, right? Because so let's just talk about vanilla quickly. Shaman are a Horde, mainstay, right? You have to have them. They are incredibly important, especially with how powerful melee is in raids. Wind Fury Totem is just, you have to use it, right? Chain Heal is just an amazing raid healing spell. And in my opinion, those things just get better in TBC and Bloodlust. And this is a big thing to say, but Shaman will be the most popular PvE class in TBC.
Yeah.
And that's, so I think the word interest is, maybe it's not everyone's cup of tea, but they're going to be there, and they're going to be very, very important integral members of raids.
I think it's a little bit of a confusing word as well. I think the people who do like Shaman really do, enjoy Shaman, and they're very hardcore fans. And you're going to see about like 4 to 5 a raid in TBC. But I think most other classes, at least the healing classes, look at Shaman a little bit bewildered, because they see us as the least kit heavy class and sort of like the least deep class, because they think that we're just brain dead chain heal spammers. So I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding as far as the Shaman class is concerned. But I think a lot of people are very excited to play Enhancement, which is a huge favorite of the melee community, and then Elemental, which people seem to be more excited to play than Resto. If anything, I'm sad that people don't want to be healers anymore.
Yeah, and Shamans in general tend in TBC to have this kind of bad reputation as support only class, in the sense that they're seen as either heal bots or spammy supports, because neither elemental nor enhancement have particularly intricate rotations. But
they can be power players.
Yeah, I mean, if you look past the rotation, if you don't focus on just the rotation, Shaman is actually one of the most interesting classes because of the choices that offers you, both in terms of what you can play, but even once you pick the one option, once you are in a raid and so on, you have a lot of choices to make about how to plan out your class. I mean, we'll probably get more into it later, but just without anticipating too much, Elemental Shaman, for example, has a lot of mana management to do, totem placement, and it has a lot more to manage than what you would expect, for example, from a Warlock. So it is a lot less simple than it might appear at first sight.
All right. Well, look, Melderon, you kind of, in your answer, you absolutely saw where I was going with this one, because you've already touched on one of the big talking points with Shaman moving into TBC, and we'd be silly not to talk about it pretty early on, and that is the wave of Shaman that may be coming in this expansion, because we've spent the first couple of episodes of Countdown to Crusade obviously focusing on a couple of the classes that go through big power boosts and will attract the meta hunters per se, in terms of the hunter and the warlock class, because they are so good in terms of the damage output they produce that a lot of people will flock there because they want to see their names on top of DPS meters. However, don't discount the Shaman class attracting a similar boon to their numbers, and Melderon, you've already shouted that out, because of a different reason, being what happens with Bloodlust and Heroism. So let's talk about Bloodlust and Heroism for a few minutes here, because I think it's interesting, Melderon, you used the words, you think it's going to be the most popular PvE class, whereas a lot of people go, there's, every man and his dog is going to have a hunter and a warlock, but you would suggest that every man and his dog is actually going to have a shaman. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that is going to come from the raid compositions that we'll talk about a little bit later on. Not that it's horrible to talk about it now lightly as well, but people are saying, you're going to have 5, you're going to have 6 shamans in every fucking 25-man raid group because of this Bloodlust and Heroism thing. They're just going to roll, and you're going to be, shamans are going to be your best friend, whether you know it or not now. It's coming. So talk to me a bit more about this huge population influx that you think might be coming with Shaman a bit more.
So there's two dynamics here. One is Bloodlust or Heroism, depending on what faction. Same thing. It's the most powerful PvE cooldown in the game, in my opinion. Increases all speed by 30% for 40 seconds. And if you're, I guess the listeners, their most recent memory of Bloodlust is probably post TBC, where it's a raid-wide debuff called Sated, that your whole raid can't get it again, right? Well, in TBC, that doesn't exist. It's a party-wide buff. The only cooldown associated with Bloodlust is the shaman that's using it, which is a 10-minute cooldown. But that can be given to, a player receiving Bloodlust can receive it over and over and over again. So we're going to see probably this meta that's probably going to develop, that's going to rotate around Shaman. We talked about totem twisting on this podcast before. Shaman twisting is going to be a real thing as well, moving Shaman to the highest DPS group to pop Bloodlust. So you have potentially 5 shaman that are going to be using this Bloodlust in the raid to boost raid-wide DPS. Some will run 4, but still 4 to 5 that's a huge number. And on top of that, you have the fact that all 3 shaman specs are viable. Enhancement got a huge boost to their DPS. Mandatory, yeah, exactly. A huge boost to their DPS, a huge boost to their mana conservation. Same thing with Elemental. Elemental, not only their DPS is higher, their mana conservation is better, their raid-wide utility is better. Now Shaman don't just buff melee, they also buff casters with Totem of Wrath and Wrath of Air Totem. Then you have Resto Shaman with improved chain heal, even stronger than it was in vanilla, Earth Shield. It's a win-win. You're not only going to bring Shaman, you're going to bring a varied amount of Shaman. You're going to bring all 3 specs to a raid in most circumstances. Not all, but in most.
It's something you just mentioned there that I didn't know about. You talked about the sated debuff, Melderon. Is that something that came in Wrath?
I believe it was Wrath. Do you know?
I think it was in the pre-patch for Wrath, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so this was something that was installed to stop the rolling Bloodlust or Heroism buffs, is it? That just kept it up, the uptime constantly on the raid?
Mm-hmm. Which is stupidly overpowered.
It was also a must in order to make Bloodlust a raid-wide buff, because otherwise it would have been just stupid.
True.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Egregious, let me throw it over to you, because you sound like you got a bit to say on it when you say it was stupidly overpowered, and I think many people would probably agree with you, because, you know, this isn't part of the meta that I was aware of coming into TBC this time, but it's one of the first points that the community has been raising, and they've been talking about it a lot, going Bloodlust Heroism, blah, 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 blah. Just make sure you bring your 5 Shaman and always have it up. And it's the one thing that spoke out to me as, you know, someone who moderates a subreddit on the topic and, you know, keeps an eye on the topics that are coming up on a regular basis. I found it funny that we spent so much time discussing the issues with drums and like, oh, let's do something about drums. Oh, this drums thing, this is no good. Oh, everyone's going to have leather working. And why don't we consider, you know, the tinnitus debuff that they were considering that Melderon was there when we discussed a few weeks ago on the show. But nobody talks about whether or not Bloodlust or Heroism is actually good for TBC and whether or not there should be a debuff like Sated in TBC. Where do you weigh in on it, Egregious?
I enjoy the sort of unique problems with these games, right? Like classic TBC or maybe even classic Wrath. I like that sort of flavor, but I can absolutely agree with the community that it is incredibly overpowered. If you look at the application of multiple Bloodlusts concurrently or simultaneously, in one raid group, specifically either your primary melee or your primary ranged group, like the implications DPS wise for those party members is absolutely absurd. So while it doesn't benefit the entire raid in the same way that it would if it was a raid wide buff and then applying a raid wide debuff sated, it has almost like it can scale to an even more sort of out of control level because you're really, you know, you're applying a minute, 20 seconds of haste to a single party, which does just crazy things to rotations.
I do think that in Bloodlust gets a lot of bad rep for being overpowered compared at least to Wrath of the Lich King, but in fact I think that it offers a lot more interesting planning than what it does in Wrath of the Lich King. In Wrath of the Lich King, you basically do Bloodlust once for your entire raid and that's it. So you have 40 seconds of Bloodlust and you plan your Bloodlust usage entirely around that 40-second window. In TBC it's different because as we said, it's a party-wide buff. So you can either stack all these Bloodlusts on one group or spread them around multiple groups. And you hear a lot of people talking about this Bloodlust stacking as if all we'll see in TBC will be Bloodlust group stacking, where we put all Bloodlust on the same group. But you got to realize that if you use all your Bloodlust on the same group, you're basically spreading your Bloodlust over 200 seconds, so a bit more than 3 minutes. There will be some situations where you actually want to make your burst window much shorter than 3 minutes. So having Bloodlust as a party-wide buff offers a lot more choice to the raid about how long do I want my burst window to be. Do I want a long burst window like on Brutalus, or do I want a much shorter one like on Reliquary of Souls, for example?
It's very useful for meta plays like he's saying, where you can decide where you want that damage, if you want it for an ad phase, if you want it for just a boss burn. So it's a much more dynamic use of the spell.
Yeah, there is a lot more group reasoning in TBC, and that's what makes raid composition much more interesting than what happens, for example, in Wrath of the Lich King.
Absolutely.
Guys, I just want to throw a couple of comments from Twitch chat at you and just a reminder to everyone listening that if you want to be part of these recordings live, obviously I stream them at twitch.tv/Josh Corbett, small plug there, but get your questions in live and then you can be part of the show. And regular guest of the show, Mike, has this one. who says basically, look, it's just going to be hunters and locks getting it cycled through, and everyone else gets the middle finger in a way for the min-max guilds. Do you guys agree or disagree with that?
I disagree. I mean, it's going to be, if you're looking at specifically a straight DPS burn, yes, it could be the warlocks or just whoever is the highest performing DPS at the time, where it doesn't lose effect from like being mitigated by rotation. But I don't think that the boss fights will work entirely the same as they will with Classic. They're longer, they're more complex. You may want to apply Bloodlust in bursts or in unique, situations. So I don't necessarily think that's true, though. In raw DPS output terms, I think that's true.
Okay. What about this one from Booth, who's going to be in on the next call, who says, I think the TBC version of Bloodlust is better. You can target specific groups at specific points. It's better for tackling raid encounters, but it's a shame you can stack them to cheese logs. Now, talk to me about this log cheesing business.
That's definitely more true.
Yeah, I mean, it will certainly ruin personal logs in the same way, for example, Ignite does for mages in Classic. But I think that in TBC you must look at the raid-on performance, because there is a lot more stuff that ruins personal logs in TBC than just Bloodlust. You have raid compositions, how much innervates you are going to get, whether Bloodlust will be used on one boss or another, because you got to realize that if you are speedrunning something like, I don't know, Karazhan, you won't always have Bloodlust for each encounter. So I think that ultimately what we'll compete on, if we want to compete, will be speed clearances and guild-wide logs rather than personal performances and parses.
I can definitely see the nightmare that will be Kira's life trying to figure out what is and what is not a legitimate parse, though, with the drums and Bloodlust stacking. I can definitely see that as a very large issue. But I think that people take that too seriously, and they should just calm down and just be what it is. Like the top end parse game should just be the top end parse game.
Okay. Fair enough. Guys, let's move on to something that people usually want to hear a little bit about, and that is, people who might be rolling a shaman for TBC sitting around saying, what race do I play? I know there's a lot of guides out there that people can go and look up, but just out of interest, if you guys have any particular preference, it's something where, let's start from a different angle now. Obviously the Draenei are coming in TBC, and that brings shaman to the Alliance, which is a bit of a game changer. Are you guys on the train of obviously let's have some extra leveling time for Draenei Shaman and for Horde Paladins? Let's get them in weeks early so that people get their chance to get them up?
I don't see the harm, but I don't really want to do that, no.
Same.
Okay.
Not for any selfish reason. But.
No. 1 second. Sorry. I'll throw it to you a second, Zoraida. Agree, just out of interest. It's not something that I see come up that often, because not that I particularly care one way or the other, but the popular opinion does seem to be like, yeah, Blizzard, come on, give us our chance to level early. I've not heard many people go like, no, fuck them. Just level when it comes out.
I think that's part of the interesting dynamic that existed in that first couple weeks. I just think it's more interesting. I don't know, it creates a very temporary and unique window in rating. So
okay, yeah, fair enough. Zoraida, go for it. You're going to say something?
I mean, one con that people often don't consider when they ask for this is that for the Alliance it's not much of a problem, because they need all the shamans they can get. But for the Horde it's another matter, because there are few less slots for paladins in raids than you have for shamans. So having the option to reroll a Blood Elf Paladin earlier than launch can result in a few too many people rerolling Paladin than what would be healthy for a server. Whereas if you have them at launch only, you may have only the people who really want to do it actually do it, which may result in a healthier population in the long term. That's my main concern.
That's an interesting concern.
Yeah.
Here's one that I hadn't really considered. Booth is saying in Twitch chat, obviously maybe somewhat similar vein to what we're talking about, but, from the Alliance perspective, we're all Horde players here, aren't we?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm Horde.
Yeah, so if we were to try and look at it from the Alliance's perspective, the Alliance already being heavily disadvantaged by the imbalance in population that exists in the game. Booth is saying that it just creates an extra disadvantage for the Alliance by not having the chance to get their army of Shaman ready to go at 60 for going through the Dark Portal and getting ready to raid as soon as possible. And it's just extra punishment that Blizzard would be heaping on the Alliance population. What do you guys think of that?
I mean, the game is best when it's not perfectly balanced, for one, and then two, haven't the Alliance had a massive advantage since BWL in Classic?
I personally don't want, of course, the Alliance to be disadvantaged against the Horde in every way. But at the same time, I think it's a bit complicated to assess whether not having Paladins or not having Shamans will be the biggest handicap early on, because it's true that Bloodlust is amazing and all you want, but Paladins bring a lot of stability to the raid in the sense that they reduce your threat, they raise your health, and they provide an additional kind of tank, which even early on can be a huge asset. So from a speedrunning perspective, of course, and maybe even a Word first perspective, probably Horde will be advantaged. But for the average raid, I do wonder if perhaps Paladins offer a bit more safety and for the less hardcore raid.
They definitely do. I mean, even like the Classic race aside, obviously Progress and Apes were pretty far ahead. Onslaught was very close behind. I think that the instability of the Horde raid in Classic due to lack of salve is a huge reason that Horde struggle to push top end speeds where, your raid can devolve in just a matter of seconds. So you could argue in TBC the advantages clearly favored Horde because of Bloodlust, but if you fuck up because you're going to ham to Zug, you could easily, out-threat your tank and wipe your raid. So I don't really see a necessarily clear advantage. In boss situations alone, from a speed perspective on the boss, yes, a clear advantage to Horde. But overall, from a raid perspective, I don't know if I agree.
Never go full Zug. All right. Well, Egregious, if I can push you a little bit, because I'm going to try and mind meld with Booth here a little bit, because I have a funny feeling he might be saying this at home, whether or not he's screaming at his computer or not, I can't tell. But, I understand where you're coming from in terms of where you say, well, because Alliance have Paladins in Classic, the rating has been leaning their way thus far. And that's obviously particularly of note in the speedrunning community. However, would you not say that somewhat balances against the overall population and the PvP madness that the Alliance has had to suffer at the hands of the Horde through Classic, and that now we shouldn't put the boot in even more to the Alliance in that regard in TBC? Or do you stick to your point and say, nah, fuck them?
I mean, that's a good health of the game argument in question, and from that perspective, I might be inclined to agree, but I'm a raid logging parse lord, so from my perspective, I'm somewhat less. I just think I don't know if it necessarily totally imbalances the tables from a specifically rating centric perspective, just for the first 2 weeks.
Fair enough. Egregious. Can I just get your verbal approval to market a T-shirt for the Countdown community now that says "Raid Logging Pass Lord"?
Yeah, sure. Sounds good.
Excellent. You heard it here, guys. The legal rights are mine. All right. Now, Melderon, let me throw it over to you, mate. Because I want to just get maybe a bit of an easier one, or lob this one over the plate. Orc versus Troll, Draenei with the hit chance, all that shit. Talk to us about races and choices.
I mean, so Alliance obviously doesn't have a choice, right? So Draenei is it. The hit is not bad, right? It's 1% spell hit though, right? So that's something to remember.
Well, no, we discussed this on the show. It changes, doesn't it, depending on
right? But Shaman gives spell hit.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. So it depends on your class. That is 100% true. But Shaman are going to give spell hit, right? And that's great starting off, but I feel like, again, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but I feel like that spell hit gets less and less impactful as the gearing comes out.
Especially as an elemental shaman.
Correct. With elemental shaman come out of the gate with a shitload of crit and hit.
So fun.
Yeah. So it's again, it's not a horrible thing, but that's your only choice as Alliance. Gift of the Naru is actually pretty cool too. It's an instant heal that has no mana cost. I know that sounds stupid, but like that could save you.
It's not instant.
It's got a cast. It's real bad.
I'm sorry. It's a 1.5 second.
It's really garbage.
1.5
yeah, people
second
give Gift of the Naru a lot of shit.
It's okay.
Yeah, people give it a lot of shit.
I don't know why I thought it was instant. No, but 1.5 second. But it doesn't
because
have
it was probably
cost.
bad and they changed it.
Yeah. But it doesn't have a mana cost.
Yes.
So again, yeah. So you're. I mean, that's it. That's your only choice. Horde. So for enhancement, this is my opinion. I think Eeg has some different opinions, especially with Tauren. But for enhancement and elemental, in my opinion, you go Orc because of Blood Fury. Because Blood Fury has changed, right? It's not just attack power anymore. It also gives a spell power. So for an elemental shaman or an enhancement shaman, my number one position would go Orc. For Resto, I'll let E talk about Tauren because he loves Tauren for Resto. But if you're talking about just straight numbers, Troll with Berserking, because Blood Fury does not affect healing at all. So that faster, being able to pop Berserking and maybe get out some heals quicker could be very, very impactful, especially for parsing. And that's my opinion when it comes to Horde racials.
Yeah, restoration shamans depend a lot on haste in TBC, so Troll is undisputedly the best choice for PvE Resto in TBC.
100%.
Yeah.
Okay. As Ailes pointing out in Twitch chat, he's saying Gift of the Naru didn't scale with spell power at first either. He's not sure what patch changed it. But my impression of Gift of the Naru was very much so a gift that many Alliance players wanted to return. Yeah, we'll be re-gifting this one. Thanks, Blizzard. But guys, let's get into a few of my silly little questions about Shaman. And please, by all means, if this goes off on more interesting tangents, then so be it. But some things that I pointed out or pulled up from the subreddit were questions like this. Now, Totemic Recall or Totemic Call, Meldron, you can field this one considering you're humming along in agreement. People were wondering if this was a Wrath or a TBC thing. It seems to be a TBC thing. Did you guys not? So did you not have anything in Classic WoW where you hit a button and it just, I presume it just wipes all your totems?
Well, there was a line, a command script that was patched, that they removed, that you could cancel your totems. But no, there's supposed to be no recall or sort of totem cancellation ability.
So every shaman
so
probably
does it
has.
refund you the mana?
It does in TBC.
Yeah, Totemic Call refunds 25%. So if you have, let's say you throw down 4 totems and you use Totemic Call, you'll get one of those totems free, basically.
Yes.
But so another thing about Totemic Call, why it's so impactful, I mean, I'll raise my hand on this. I've wiped a raid because I left the totem out, right?
I've never done that.
in MC, when we were skipping trash in MC a lot because it's MC, right? And I would leave a Wind Fury totem down or something, or it was usually a water totem. So we would be running. All of a sudden, here comes like 6 dogs. And then I'm like, son of a bitch, dude. And then I left the totem out and they just ran out. So this Totemic Call is also an anti-wipe mechanic, in my opinion.
This is actually even more relevant in TBC because you have a few more important totems to cast. For example, even if you are in a caster group, you got to use Wrath of the Air totem, and as an elemental shaman, you also have a Totem of Wrath. So having the ability to refund your mana by removing your totems is really relevant in TBC.
Well, Shaman should be in Classic if they're not in a melee group for whatever reason. What reason that may be. They should be casting Tranquil Air Totem. I know a lot of Shaman don't, and that's bad, and you're wrong. So you should at least have an air and a water totem down right now in Classic.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think that one is pretty cheap, right?
I actually don't know what the cost of
I don't remember either, to be honest.
I don't know. I don't pay attention.
Guys, let's keep on the totem track and just let me know, are there any new fun toys in terms of totems in TBC? Now, let's not touch on too much Totem of Wrath. I know that that's coming with your new fun 41-point talent in Elemental. We'll get there very, very soon. But outside of Totem of Wrath, is Totem of Wrath an actual totem, or is it just a spell that you use?
It's a totem.
It's a totem.
It's a totem. Okay. So outside of Totem of Wrath, are there any other fun new totems, or it's just the same old, same old?
Just the one.
The elemental totems, fire elemental and earth elemental.
Oh, yeah, those ones.
I think
Those
fire
are cool.
elemental in particular will be really relevant for speed runs. I don't know.
Totally forgot.
Yeah.
I have to include that in the guide right now. I didn't include those two.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's actually on a shared cooldown with Earth Elemental Totem, which is great for soloing because it's like
Which
a
people
tank.
wipe raids with. Don't do that.
Yeah, exactly. But if you're solo in the world, pop that thing out whenever it's off cooldown, man. You got a tank for what? What is it, 2 minutes?
2 minutes.
You have a personal tank.
Hang on, I'm still taking notes like fucking Homer Simpson over here. Like, wiping raids equals bad is my one takeaway from this chat so far. Sorry, keep going, Melderon.
And then outside of those, like Wrath of Air Totem, right? So it's confusing. There's Totem of Wrath and there's Wrath of Air Totem. Wrath of Air Totem everyone gets, and that increases spell power and healing by 101. So Elemental and Resto Shamans are going to be using this as well. Yeah.
What's unfortunate about that totem, though, is it doesn't apply an aura similar to Wind Fury Totem, so you're not able to really effectively twist. Because if it did apply an aura like Wind Fury Totem, you could twist Tranquil Air and Wrath of Air Totem, but like instead you can just replace them within your group.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I don't think it applies an aura because...
no, it doesn't. I'm just saying that because it doesn't, you can't really twist. You can just replace.
Yeah. But in my opinion, like the single most important... Outside of Bloodlust, the single most important new spell is Water Shield. I don't know if we have time to talk about that, but that's...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, go nuts.
So, mana conservation has been something that Shaman, Enhancement, and Elemental mostly have been, dealing with for a very long time in Classic. So Water Shield, Lightning Shield is a shield you put on, it does some extra damage when you get hit, right? Water Shield, you can't have both on, but Water Shield to me is the most important Shaman shield out there. It has no mana cost, so that's huge, right? Mm-hmm. It does cost a GCD, so that's something you have to think about. But as long as it's active, you're regenerating mana, right? And if you get hit, it has three charges, just like Lightning Shield. If you get hit, you get even more mana back. This should be up all the time, regardless of your spec, in my opinion.
It also counts as a successful spellcast, so it will trigger the proc chance for Insightful Earthstorm Diamond.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Another thing that really affects mana sustenance in TBC for Resto Shamans is that you can still down rank in TBC like you can do in Classic. And for the most part, you'll probably still use rank 1 Chain Heal as your main healing spell. But the big difference is that the mana cost stay the same, but your mana pool does not. So you will actually spend a lot less mana in TBC than you do in Classic. Because right now, one of the big problems of Resto Shamans compared to other healing classes is that their main healing spell is a spell that they get really late. So
at level 40.
Even the first rank has a hefty mana cost compared to, Heal Touch, Flash
Heal 1 or something.
Yeah. And this affects the mana sustenance of Resto Shamans in Classic heavily. In TBC, things will change. You will be able to work a lot more on your spell haste. And in general, you will be a much more functional healer who needs to worry a lot less about your mana.
All right, guys, we're going to get into all the specs now, and I just want to stop and congratulate you all because you are all killing it. There is some big brain stuff going around here, and I've never felt so dumb during a countdown call. I'm listening to you all going, wow, these guys are really smart. I don't know anything about shamans, and they are just laying down the education. But guys, keep it up. Let's start going through some of these trees. And I just foreshadowed it before, but let's start with Elemental because I do want to focus on that Totem of Wrath ability. And I am very fixated on what TBC brought all the different classes and all the different specs in terms of that nice new shiny 41-point talent. Because, and I'll ask Kevin Jordan about this eventually when he comes on the show, just going, there must have been a lot of pressure to come up with something that really sings out to players in TBC. You want that, 41-point talent to be really desirable. And I personally think that Blizzard knocked it out of the park with Totem of Wrath. He's sitting there going like, holy shit, 3% spell hit and 3% spell crit all rolled into one, if I'm getting that right. That sounds fucking amazing. And Elemental, even in Classic WoW is pretty much described as, the PvP spec, I believe. And it's got the mana issues and everything, but you can still blow people up with the burst. But I'll just open with this one for the floor, and you guys can piggyback off of each other. Talk to me about Totem of Wrath. Do you think that this was the best improvement you got in TBC or the best stability?
Yeah, for an Elemental Shaman. It makes them mandatory because it allows you, if you run an Elemental Shaman, for the casters in that group to drop hit, which increases the amount of damaging stats that they can put on their character. So just a net win.
In fact, it is so relevant that you can expect most casters, especially Warlock, to build their entire equipment around the 3% hit they get from Totem of Wrath.
Yeah, if you look at like Warlock builds, they will say like, early Warlocks will probably go Affliction, and then it's, it even says in most of their guides, once you get the 10% hit without Totem of Wrath, that's when you switch to destruction. So it's like you said, Warlocks are kind of built around this totem. Exactly. I mean, like Shaman shouldn't, Shaman, like I always go back to D&D, right? Shaman are very powerful in their own right, but like the fact when you pick a Shaman, you have some support, right? You are very supportive in your role. And that's just something that I think is great about Totem of Wrath, because not only does it help you out, but it helps other people out, right? And that's what a Shaman should be doing, in my opinion.
One thing that is not discussed a lot about Elemental Shamans is that they are the only hybrid caster who can actually do competent healing without ruining their DPS output excessively, because unlike Shadow Priest and unlike Boonkins, they don't have to switch out of their forms to do healing, and this allows you to perform quite life-saving actions during a raid. I remember, for example, that during an Illidan fight, our Warlock tank died, and for a few seconds, as an Elemental Shaman, I tanked the Illidan in his demon phase just by spamming healing wave on me after having cross-shocked the boss for extra threat. So that's the kind of flexibility that Elemental Shaman has, and you won't find it in other hybrid classes without significant sacrifice in terms of performance.
So when shit hits the fan, it's not the worst off healer to have in an emergency.
You can transition into emergency healing much easier and at much lesser cost than other classes can.
Very true.
Egregious, you were going to jump in?
Oh, no. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Melder, it sounded like someone was going to say something there.
No.
All good. Crickets. Look, guys, let's talk about the elemental tree in general, because I'll get your comments on all of the trees, just in terms of if you thought Blizzard did a good job with the tinkering and the additions and the subtractions in TBC with this particular tree. So incorporating what we've just said about Totem of Wrath, were you happy with the elemental changes in TBC?
I definitely am. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. It's a much more complete class. I love Elemental in TBC. I don't like Elemental in Classic. It's very flat. I know a lot of people still like it, but crit with Lightning Capacitor and Lightning Overload it's just more entertaining. Totem of Wrath is obviously great, but it's more of a complete class. People will still rag on it, the idea that it's a complete class because it's 2 buttons, but I think it's a much more functional spec.
Yeah. I mean,
go ahead, please.
I mean, a lot of casters have their procs like Ignite or Improve the Shadow Bolt, but I think that none of them compare in terms of the feeling that gives you to Lightning Overload. It was really an excellent addition from Blizzard.
And that slot machine crit go burr.
Lightning Overload's a really interesting one. If people aren't aware, this is the talent that basically lets you throw out an extra lightning bolt passively at half strength, as a proc from some of your own lightning bolts, I believe. If I butcher that, guys, let me know. Yeah. But it speaks to, and this is just a lifeline to the casual player, in my opinion, because I look at that being a fucking scrub. And you know what scrubs love? They fucking love passive abilities. I don't have to do anything.
Yep.
And this is like manna from heaven for me. So talk to me a bit more about Lightning Overload and what it means to you.
Well, the funny thing is it is literally manna from heaven, right? Because so I look at it this way. So RNG is like kind of what Shaman DPS is built around, right? So Wind 100%. Fury obviously is RNG. And this is as well. So this is a 20% chance, just like Wind Fury. You get an extra lightning bolt or chain lightning to come out.
That's the best one.
Yeah, try chain lightning.
I actually didn't know that.
That's the
Depends
best.
on the spell you are casting. If you cast lightning bolt, you get an extra lightning bolt. If you cast a chain lightning, you get an extra chain lightning.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and it's like what you said is correct. It's half damage, but the best part is it's also no additional threat. So that's huge as well. So it's literally just free DPS that's coming out 20% of the time.
And it can proc Elemental Focus.
Correct. Mm-hmm. Elemental Focus Elemental Focus was changed in vanilla. It's a 10% flat chance to get a free cast. In TBC, it actually changes a little bit, right? So the way Elemental Focus works is after landing a critical strike, the next two spells have a 40% reduction of mana. So what you're thinking about here is really cool. Is if you're building your crit out, right? Most people would think you're building your crit, and that's somehow either not reducing, but leaving your mana conservation normal. But the more you crit as an Elemental Shaman, the more you proc clear casting. So the more, I wouldn't say free, because it's a 40% reduction instead of a free cast, but still, the more crit you have, the more mana you're saving. So it's not, so like Eek said, yeah, okay, it's a 2-button rotation, but there's a lot going on underneath the sheets, right? There's a lot going on that's like happening that you're just building passively with an Elemental Shaman, and I think that's really cool. Like you said, I think a lot of what word did you use, Josh? People who are I don't know,
scrubs.
Scrubs will love Elemental Shaman, and I do. So there you go.
And one great thing about Elemental Shamans is that unlike many classes, such as for example Protection Paladins, they come right off the box with a lot of inbuilt stats that they really need a lot. You get 13% crit just from your class because you get Tidal Mastery from the Restoration tree. You get Call of Thunder from the Elemental tree, and then you get Totem of Wrath. So early on, you might even top the meters like you wouldn't expect a support class to do. You might peter out in the later TBC, but you are still going to be one of the best support in terms of DPS. And for the kind of support you bring, that's really amazing.
Yep. Okay. Melderon, if you're not familiar with the term scrub, I'll let you know that a scrub is a guy that thinks he's fly. He's also known as a buster. So thank you, Egregious, for that.
I've never heard buster though. Yeah.
All right. I'll redirect you to the gospel of TLC, but that's all good. Now, guys, it's funny because in hearing all of this, I just start to get more of an impression that Elemental sounds actually rather overpowered. But then I sit back and I wonder, hang on, with all these fucking amazing toys that you got, why don't we talk about Elemental Shamans pushing up for the top of the damage meters? What was it is it like itemization? Is it the RNG? What is it that actually held you guys back despite the fact that this tree was so heavily bolstered in TBC?
It's just other classes scale better. So like we can start off in tier 4. Like there are definitely times where I've been on the top of a boss fight, and it happened. The longer the burn phase, the more you'll fall behind. And then certain classes like warlocks and mages just start scaling really well, and then you have to sort of wait because you'll reach crit soft cap relatively quickly in like tier 5, and then you just sort of have to wait for haste, and you don't really get significantly better over time.
Moving on, guys, let's talk enhancement. Whether or not you sort of called it the ugly stepchild of the Shaman family, things, again, are addressed in TBC to try and make this one a bit more attractive. And it seems to be the case that people are saying, with all these Shaman that are going to be in your raid, yes, they're not all going to be Resto. You probably will have an enhancement. You probably will have an elemental. So get used to it. But enhancement to me seemed like a very, very boring talent tree in vanilla. I respect, Wind Fury and all that shit, but it seems to have changed a lot in TBC. Again, I'll start generally. Do you guys think that this was a pretty significant overhaul on Blizzard's part for Shaman?
I do. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts in here. It's kind of like Elemental. A lot of it's under the sheets, but there's a lot of things that make this a more viable DPS spec for sure. I wouldn't say the rotation's any different. It's pretty much the same, but you're still shocking on cooldown, and you're still just white hitting most of the time. You have Storm Strike has a 10-second cooldown, so you'll be Storm Striking more often.
Well, you're actually going to be able to Storm Strike.
Well, that's another good point, right? The debuff limits will allow you to Storm Strike. That's a good point. There are some Shaman out there who do it anyway. Holder Heck, I'm looking at you, but yeah. But so yeah, I mean, so I think the name of the game here is dual wield is the biggest change. Obviously, this will allow you to use 2 weapons. You can actually imbue each weapon with a different imbue. Most of the math shows that double Wind Fury is good, but I've also seen Wind Fury Flame Tongue so Wind Fury in your main hand, Flame Tongue in your offhand. A big thing we got to talk about here is that in TBC, Wind Fury has an internal cooldown for the Shaman. It can't happen more than once within a 3-second time period. So you can't get double Wind Fury procs like you could. Well, you weren't dual wielding, but you can't get like a Storm Strike auto Wind Fury combo in TBC like you could in vanilla. So that's
a heartbreaker.
Yeah, it is. And here's the best part. Wind Fury Totem. So the totem you give to the melee doesn't have an internal cooldown. So it's kind of weird, right? So, but the thing is, you're still doing more DPS with your own Wind Fury, not the totem, if that makes sense. So some people thought, oh, well, I just won't put Wind Fury in my weapon. I'll put the totem down. But the totem only grants 1 extra attack and less attack power. Wind Fury weapon, which is the imbue, grants 2 additional attacks. So it's still more beneficial to use your Wind Fury imbue over Wind Fury totem. I mean, I don't know. There's a lot. I don't know if we want to separate this, but there's actually a lot of changes in this tree. But mana conservation is big here too, and you get an additional melee buff potential. It's not just Wind Fury and Grace of Air, Strength of Earth. You get Unleash Rage. So every time you crit, you increase all the party members' attack power as well.
So I'm not sure if you mentioned the time frame, Elderon, specifically, but Mike is saying that that internal cooldown that you mentioned is 3 seconds, which seems like a lifetime.
Yeah, it's 3 seconds. Yeah, so your main hand and offhand, the slowest one-hander is 2.6 seconds. So I think you the math I've looked at. So again, Enhancement's the least experience I have, right? So all the math I looked at from Elitist Jerks, that stuff's still available. Is they just recommend going with the slowest weapon possible. This way you're minimizing that potential downtime. But, say you have two 2.6 second weapons. One of them can win Fury, but both of them can't. And then the next swing, same thing, right? So it's still an increase in DPS. It just feels bad, right? Because Enhancement Shaman are on the low end of the melee DPS, from what I've seen in a lot of the charts that we've looked at. So it would have been really nice if they didn't have this ICD, because maybe they would have been a little bit more powerful. But again, what is Shaman's role in World of Warcraft? And in my opinion, it's a buffer, with DPS as secondary. That's always how I've looked at Shaman. So that's just my perspective.
So is the hope for all these, fresh young shaman coming into TBC, where they think, oh, if I can finally be elemental, or I can finally be enhancement, maybe for the enhancement, it's not so much, it's not that they drastically buffed your DPS or anything. It's just that you've got fucking Bloodlust and Heroism, and you can drop a Wind Fury, and that's what you do.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, for our support class, the DPS is actually pretty good. They sort of scale the opposite in the sense that the Elemental Shaman starts really strong, can compete with the best DPSers early on, but peters out in the end. The Enhancement Shaman does the opposite in the sense that it starts pretty weak because it's a melee class, it's a support melee class, and so on. But by the end, it scales really well and can actually start to do DPS, which is almost on the threshold of a pure DPS class. Of course, it's still a bit below Retribution Paladins and all the pure DPS classes, but it's after those, it's probably the best DPS class. So it still scales really well in the end.
Yeah. I just feel like outside of Resto is its own beast, and Resto can be very effective.
I think it's just something that people will want to bring for a melee group. Like, I think you're going to see people want to bring an Enhancement Shaman, at least one.
Yeah. Unleash Rage, Wind Fury Totem, Strength of Earth Totem, all these things are going to benefit your melee group, and you should have one in your melee group. Like, you should definitely not go without an Enhancement Shaman in your melee group. Yeah.
All right. Well, how about... sorry, go for it, Zoraida.
Well, one thing I would tell new Shamans is don't roll Shamans unless you actually like all the specs, because even if there are like 5 slots for Shamans in all raids, for each spec, especially Elemental Enhancement, you generally don't have more than 1 or 2 slots depending on the raid. So you will surely find your slot as a Shaman, but not necessarily as the one spec you want to play, unless you are Resto, because there will almost surely be a Resto slot almost everywhere. But as an Elemental Enhancement, I mean, I've seen a lot of Elemental and Enhancement Shamans that were forced to go another spec, so an enhancement which had to go Elemental and vice versa because of raid necessities. So if you only like one Shaman spec, you might be in for disappointment. But
I think that most raids, though, will see about 5 shamans. Sometimes you can argue that, like, if you want to take 7 healers, you can bring a 6 shaman. But I think that you'll see at least 1 or 2 elemental or enhancement shamans. So there'll be 1 of each, and then 2 of the other. And depending on your group composition, it might be 2 enhancement and 1 elemental, or 2 elemental and 1 enhancement.
Yes.
Yeah. I also want to just talk real quick about Shamanistic Focus and Shamanistic Rage. So mana was always an issue. Good, I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, you're right. I've got a quote actually to set you up for this one, Melderon.
Sure.
So absolutely leap into Shamanistic Rage, but let me read this one from Frosty Poot over at the classic WoW TBC subreddit, who says much of what we've already said, but it'll be a launching pad for you. He says, enhanced shamans were very good in TBC. You're always wanted in 5-mans, and in raids you would always be wanted in melee groups. Wind Fury is still a godlike buff, along with other totems being very useful, especially if you go with blacksmithing for the early 2.7 speed Dragon Maw Hammer. You have really solid damage. Mana isn't as crazy of an issue because of your new 40 talent Shamanistic Rage. So overall, I'd say enhancement shamans bring a little bit more utility than they already did in Classic, less mana issues, improved competitive damage, and a more fun playstyle. So, focusing on those 2 keywords, Shamanistic Rage, talk to me about that one.
Yeah, so real quick, Shamanistic Focus is before that in the talent tree. So this is pretty much guaranteed to be up at all times unless your crit's abysmal. But as long as you're critting, your next shock is reduced by 60% mana. So that's big. So you're gonna be shocking on cooldown. So that's a mana reduction right there.
That's focus, is it?
That's focus, right? So Shamanistic
gotcha.
Rage, the 41 point talent. So this is kind of like I kind of consider this an evocation in a way. It's mages have evocation. This has more built into it, though. So when you pop this as a 2-minute cooldown, so you'll be able to use it multiple times per most of these boss fights because they're pretty long. Not all of them, but some of them are long. So it reduces all damage by 30%, and it gives your successful melee attacks that land a chance to regenerate mana equal to 30% of your attack power. And so for 15 seconds, as long as you're landing attacks, this is giving you mana back. So you can go from like 25% mana to 75% mana with this popped. It literally lets you keep DPSing. There's huge.
Actually, a lot of depth to Enhancement Shaman, and it can be very tight rotation. Because if you're looking to shock off cooldown and twist off cooldown, and then you can use Shamanistic Rage during either Bloodlust, one of the 2 Bloodlusts your group might get, or any of the drums. So like, there's a lot to balance if you want to use Shamanistic Rage effectively, and if you want to get every single GCD you possibly can out of a 10-second rotation.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword in Arena because you're most likely going to want to pop this because you're taking damage. So do you need the mana too at that point? Or are you low on mana and want to use it for mana in Arena? And, did you waste the fact that you can get a 30% damage reduction? But in raiding, it's just good, right? You're going to use it off cooldown in raiding.
I mean, in Arena, unless you are facing a caster, for example, you can switch to a shield to momentarily reduce damage versus a melee if necessary. So you don't necessarily have to pop Shamanistic Rage unless you really need it.
True. That's a good point.
All right. Thanks so much for that, Melderon. That makes much more sense to me now. I'll leave you guys with this one on the enhancement tree, and it's very much so stuff that we have already said, but I'll just get an agree or a disagree from you in terms of the kind of damage output roughly that an enhancement shaman could maybe look forward to in TBC. And this one comes from one of my favorite names on the subreddit, Naruwana, who says this. Shamans, like in Classic, are strong in general because of their raid utility. In TBC, however, only Ellie and Resto, quote-unquote, pull their weight in their respective roles when you focus just on damage/healing. As Enhancement in TBC, your sole purpose is to totem swap hard as fuck and DPS. I rated Enhancement on an alt in TBC and was decked in BT/High Jewel best in slot gear. I had the rotations down, I would crit for days on end, and I still couldn't compete with decent mages, hunters, warriors, rogues, locks. Guys, damage-wise, what should people realistically expect from their enhancement shaman?
You'll be above the healers and the tanks.
Okay.
Yeah, you'll be worth bringing. I don't know. I don't know what to make of that statement.
Again, shamans are not supposed to be topping DPS charts in my
opinion. Exactly. So it's like if you set your expectations for what your class role is, it's all good. But if you're there thinking you're going to rock and roll up the top of the charts and be the buff bot, you've got another thing coming.
But I think it's important to know that you can execute your entire rotation in enhancement and still totem twist, and it's not like you're twisting at a detriment to your rotation. Right, which that could feel bad if you feel like you're doing less DPS than you potentially could to provide a roll buff to the raid. Like that could feel bad, but that's not what's going to happen. That's what I don't like about twisting in Classic, is that it comes at a detriment to the Resto Shaman output, or elemental output, and that's not going to happen. Like your elemental and restos are not going to twist unless there's some extreme circumstance that requires multiple restos for group comp while also having multiple melee groups.
I would just remind the listeners and everyone on Reddit, this is when the game had roles still, like people had roles that they fulfilled. It's not like retail where everyone can potentially pop top DPS charts, heal themselves, tank, like whatever this isn't that. This is when the game was more of a tabletop role playing centric game, and shaman fulfill a certain role.
Yeah, in
Very well said.
TBC, you basically had the two echelons of damage. In the first echelon, you had the pure DPS classes, so you had hunters, warlocks, rogues, warriors later on, and mages a bit below that. And below that echelon, you had the support echelon where there were shamans, there were the Retribution Paladin, there was the Shadow Priest, and the Boonkin. But the thing that we need to tell the audience is that you will be in the second echelon, but within that second echelon, you will be at the top, especially as an Enhancement Shaman later on. Only the Retribution Paladin will be able to compete with you and maybe pulling a bit ahead. But the Elemental Shaman will first be above you, of course, by a lot, but by somewhat plateau, as an enhancement shaman, you will be above any elemental at the same level of gear, and you will be far beyond any kind of Boonkin or Shadow Priest. So you will be a super DPS, but you will be one of the best in terms of DPS output.
Yeah, very good. All right, guys, let's move on to Resto. I'm not sure how much, hopefully you guys can prove me wrong, but I'm sitting here going like, how much do we have to talk about Resto? And I'm sure there must be something, but the first thing that I want to ask is, Melderon, you alluded to this earlier because we were, throwing Chain Heal in the mix in the conversations before. And you talked about the concept of the Shaman, the Resto Shaman in Classic as the chain heal bot. And it's something that I love the concept of healing. I hated healing in 40-man raids in WoW, and I'll have a conversation on the show later on about healing in TBC and whether or not the playstyle changes. But, I do like the concept of a healer that uses their full disposal of spells and plays situationally and does all this cool shit and casts and has long casts, has short casts and everything. The thing that really turned me off ever playing a Shaman as a Resto was just the thought of hitting that one button all the time, chain heal. And even worse, that it was a chain heal, that it was a smart heal that went off and alleviated more burdens from you of thinking of just like, well, I just hit this one button and it kind of takes care of the raid or the party or whatever. Does that stay the same in TBC? I mean, granted, it seems to be the case that, yes, you will lean on chain heal very heavily, but does the floor open up to you a bit more as a Resto Shaman?
I'll quickly jump in and say that you can use a smart heal stupidly. There's a difference between the top Shaman and the median Shaman. Like, I'll put that in there before you start. Sorry.
No, I know E's gonna have a lot to say about Resto. He's the Resto champion, right? But like, real quick,